Hey everybody, it's Ron. Every Monday through Thursday, we talk about how some event in business history reshaped the world. But on Fridays, we talk about something completely different. These are the stories that went completely off the rails. They may have still changed the business world, just not in the way anyone wanted. These are the business bloopers. Somewhere in a Procter & Gamble conference room in Cincinnati, Ohio, sometime in the late 1970s, a group of researchers got an answer that they'd been dreading. No, not yet, not this way, not enough evidence. The United States Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, had reviewed the data and decided that Olestra, Procter & Gamble's synthetic fat molecule, did not demonstrate the 15% reduction in cholesterol levels required to qualify as an approved drug treatment. The team had spent years building the case. They had believed in the science, and now they were sitting in a room with a molecule that worked, that was safe, that had cost the company an enormous amount of time and money to develop, and no clear path forward for what to do with it. Someone in that room at some point had to ask the question out loud. If it can't be a drug, what is it? The answer they eventually landed on was a snack food ingredient, which probably sounded reasonable at the time. The molecule cooked like fat, tasted like fat, and passed through the human body without being absorbed. 0 calories, 0 fat, all the crunch of a potato chip with none of the consequences. On paper, it was a miracle thought. The thing about miracles, though, is that the fine print has a way of showing up later. Okay, so how did we get here? From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business Bloopers, the weekly podcast where we unpack the business decisions that sounded smart until they weren't. Every Friday, I'll take you through a real story where something went off the rails. Sometimes it's hilarious, sometimes it's painful, but always it's a reminder that even smart people screw up in business, and we'll look at why it matters. This is Business Bloopers. The story of Olestra actually starts a decade before that conference room, in a Procter & Gamble laboratory in 1968, where two researchers named Fred Mattson and Robert Volpenheim were trying to solve a genuinely important problem. Premature infants had difficulty digesting standard dietary fats, and Mattson and Volpenheim were looking for a fat molecule that would be easier for fragile digestive systems to process. What they created instead was almost the opposite. They combined sucrose with fatty acids and produced a molecule so large that the human digestive system couldn't process it at all. It didn't break down, it didn't absorb, it just passed straight through. For a premature infant study, that was a dead end. For a company paying attention to where the food industry was heading, it was something entirely different. So P&G spent years trying to figure out what to do with it. The cholesterol drug angle consumed most of the 1970s before the FDA closed that door. But by the early 1980s, the American food landscape was shifting in a direction that made Olestra look like a buried treasure. Fat was becoming the enemy. The U.S. government's dietary guidelines were pushing low-fat eating as the path to better health, and food companies were racing to respond. Snackwell's devil food cookies were selling so fast that grocery stores couldn't keep them on the shelves, not because they tasted better than regular cookies, but because they were fat-free. Consumers weren't just interested in low-fat options, they were desperate for them. P&G had a molecule that could deliver exactly that, and they'd been sitting on it for 15 years. The FDA approval process for Olestra as a food additive took nearly a decade on its own, with consumer groups raising concerns and Procter & Gamble conducting study after study to satisfy the agency's requirements. The approval finally came in January 1996, and it came with one condition. Every product containing Olestra had to carry a warning label, and that warning label had to read, "This product contains Olestra. Olestra may cause abdominal cramping and loose stools. Olestra inhibits the absorption of some vitamins and other nutrients. Vitamins A, D, E, and K have been added." Now, Procter & Gamble and Frito-Lay, which had licensed Olestra to use it in its Lay's Ruffles, Doritos, and Tostitos lines, looked at that label and just saw a footnote, something to acknowledge and move past. The product launched nationally in February 1998 under the WOW brand, with heavy marketing and genuine consumer excitement. First-year sales hit $347 million. WOW chips were the best-selling new food product in the United States that year. Nobody was thinking about the footnote yet. Not long after the FDA's announcement about the approval of Olestra went out, talk show host David Letterman's top 10 list on The Late Show was dedicated entirely to the new fat substitute. One of the entries on that list read, "We can't tell you exactly how they make it, but we can say this: 10 monkeys go into a room and only 9 come out." Not to be outdone, The Tonight Show's host Jay Leno looked into the camera, held up a mock bag of the chips, and told his audience, "When you're through with the Pringles, you might want to hang on to the can." And here's something to realize about the timing. These jokes had actually started before a single bag of WOW chips had reached a store shelf. Procter & Gamble and Frito-Lay had anticipated some skepticism. They had not anticipated becoming a recurring bit in late-night monologues 18 months before the national launch. By the time WOW hit grocery stores in 1998, the warning label that was supposed to be a footnote had become the entire story. Comedians weren't just making jokes about a product. They were making jokes about a warning label that used the phrase "loose stools" on a snack food bag, which is a combination of words that, once you've read them next to a picture of a potato chip, is very difficult to forget. Consumer complaints started arriving at the FDA almost immediately after the launch. People were reporting cramps, urgency, and experiences they were describing in terms that were making their way onto the internet, which in 1998 was just beginning to become a place where stories like this could spread fast and far. Road trip stories, movie theater stories, stories that nobody wanted to be the subject of, but everybody wanted to tell about to someone else. By the time the wave crested, the FDA and Procter & Gamble had received more than 20,000 adverse reaction reports combined. Frito-Lay pushed back. Their own studies showed that the majority of consumers experienced no symptoms at all, and that the reaction rate was comparable to eating high-fiber foods like beans or broccoli, which was probably true. And also, completely irrelevant, because broccoli had never been the subject of a Letterman Top 10 list, and nobody had ever warned you to hang on to an empty can after finishing a bowl of broccoli. The moment control was lost wasn't a single event. It was the warning label itself. On day one, in combination with a late-night comedy infrastructure that was only too happy to do the rest. Once the phrase "anal leakage" attached itself to WOW chips in the public imagination, no amount of clinical data was going to detach it. Remarkably, Frito-Lay sold $347 million worth of Wow chips in 1998. Procter & Gamble had been projecting $1 billion in Olestra sales by the year 2000. What they got instead was roughly half that, and the number was still falling. By 2000, sales had dropped by more than 50% from the launch year peak. The jokes hadn't stopped, the complaints hadn't stopped, and consumers who had never experienced a single symptom were still quietly putting the bag back on the shelf because the possibility had been planted and they couldn't unplant it. A 2001 episode of Futurama, Bending in the Wind, referenced Olestra as a relic. The product was 3 years old and already being treated as a punchline from a previous era. The FDA removed the mandatory warning label requirement in 2003, citing a Procter & Gamble study of more than 3,000 people showing only a modest increase in digestive complaints among Olestra consumers. Consumer advocacy group, the Center for Science in the Public Interest, the CSPI, which had been tracking complaints since 1996, objected loudly, pointing to the 20,000 adverse reaction reports already on file. The label came off anyway. It didn't matter. The association was permanent. Frito-Lay quietly rebranded Wow chips as Lay's Light in 2004 with no fanfare and no campaign. The name Wow, which had once been the best-selling new food product in America, was retired without ceremony. Lay's Light lasted until 2016, when it was discontinued entirely. Procter & Gamble, which had spent somewhere between $200 and $500 million developing Olestra over nearly 3 decades, eventually found a use for the molecule that nobody in the Cincinnati conference room had seen coming. In 2009, P&G licensed Olestra as an ingredient in eco-friendly paints and lubricants, sold under the name CFOS. The fat substitute that was going to revolutionize American snacking ended up in a deck stain. Something I like to do when I share these business blooper stories is end by spending just a little bit of time looking at what actually went wrong. So in this case, what went wrong? The easy answer is the warning label, but that's not quite right either, because the label was required, and Procter & Gamble had no choice but to put it there. The real mistake was assuming that consumers process risk information the same way a clinical study does. P&G had the data. Most people experienced no symptoms. The reaction rate was comparable to fiber-rich vegetables. From a purely scientific standpoint, the concerns were manageable. But consumers don't make snack food decisions based on clinical data. They make them based on how something makes them feel. And a warning label on a potato chip bag that mentions abdominal cramping and loose stools makes people feel something very specific, regardless of the actual probability. Then late-night comedy got involved. And what was already an uncomfortable association became a cultural fixture. Letterman and Leno weren't inventing the story. They were just amplifying what the label had already said out loud. Once a joke reaches that scale, it stops being about the product and starts being about the idea of the product, and no amount of reformulation or rebranding can fully reach it. The broader pattern here is one that shows up whenever a company confuses scientific legitimacy with consumer confidence. They are not the same thing. You can be right about all the data and still lose the market, because the market isn't running on data. The molecule that started as an accident in 1968 spent a decade trying to become a heart medication and ended up on late-night television as a punchline about potato chips. It eventually found its place in deck stain and industrial lubricants. Sometimes the market tells you something the lab never will. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business Bloopers, part of the Business Daily podcast lineup, where we look at how business really works and sometimes how it really doesn't. New episodes drop every weekday with fun, full-length blooper stories like this one on Fridays and quick-hit business history episodes the rest of the week. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the ride, please don't forget to leave a quick review and subscribe. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to actually understand business without the fluff or the buzzwords or the MBA language, start by visiting us at bsnsDAILYpodcasts.com.